Imagine this. You stride into a courthouse with designer sunglasses still perched on your head, your phone glowing in your hand, and the absolute certainty that the next 10 minutes will be a minor inconvenience before you return to your privileged life. Then a single sentence from a judge shatters that illusion so completely that within 24 hours, millions of people will know your name for all the wrong reasons. The heavy wooden doors of Providence Municipal Court swung open at exactly 10:15 on a Tuesday morning. And the sharp click of expensive heels echoed against the marble floors like a countdown to disaster. Madison Pierce, 23 years old, only daughter of real estate mogul Richard Pierce, walked into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom as if she were entering a boutique rather than a court of law. Her Prada sunglasses remained firmly positioned on top of her perfectly styled blonde hair despite the indoor setting. Her Louis Vuitton bag swung from her shoulder with practiced carelessness. Her fingers moved across her phone screen with the focused intensity of someone who believed that whatever was happening in her digital world mattered infinitely more than the physical courtroom around her. She didn't glance at the judge. She didn't acknowledge the bailiff. She certainly didn't notice the dozen citizens sitting in the gallery, watching her entrance with expressions that ranged from curiosity to immediate disapproval. What Madison Pierce didn't know as she approached the defendant's podium while still scrolling through Instagram was that the next 8 minutes would cost her $15,000, her driver's license for 6 months, her reputation among the 47,000 followers who currently worshipped her lifestyle, and any remaining illusion that her father's money could protect her from the consequences of her own choices. She had no idea that Judge Frank Caprio had spent the previous evening reviewing every detail of her case, reading through 7 previous traffic violations that her father's lawyers had made disappear, and examining social media posts where she openly mocked the legal system and the people who worked within it. She didn't know that 2 previous judges had called Judge Caprio personally to warn him about her attitude and her father's pattern of making problems vanish with expensive legal maneuvering and strategic donations. She walked into that courtroom believing that this hearing would follow the same script as every other consequence she had faced in her 23 years of existence. Inconvenient, briefly annoying, and ultimately resolved by her father's checkbook without any real impact on her life. The charge on the docket seemed simple enough on the surface. Reckless driving. 80 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour residential zone. Expired registration that she had forgotten to renew because such mundane details were supposedly handled by other people. Refusing to sign the citation when pulled over because she had immediately called her father instead of cooperating with the police officer. But what elevated this from a routine traffic violation to something far more serious was buried in the officer's report, written in the careful language of someone who had dealt with entitled drivers before but had never encountered someone quite like Madison Pierce. The officer had noted that her vehicle had passed within 3 feet of a 9-year-old boy riding his bicycle home from school. He had documented that when informed of how close she had come to killing a child, Madison had responded by saying the kid should have been on the sidewalk and that she couldn't be expected to drive 35 miles per hour just because parents in the neighborhood couldn't control their children. The officer had written that when he attempted to explain the severity of the violation, she had interrupted him to say that her father was Richard Pierce, that they had lawyers on retainer, and that this conversation was wasting her time because she had a photo shoot to attend. The bailiff called her name and gestured toward the podium, but Madison finished typing her text message before acknowledging him. She walked forward slowly, her posture radiating the kind of boredom that suggested she had better places to be and more important things to do. Judge Frank Caprio watched her approach with the patient expression that had defined his 38 years on the bench. He had built his reputation on compassion, on understanding that people who appeared before him were often experiencing the worst days of their lives, on giving second chances to those who showed genuine remorse and a willingness to change. He had reduced fines for struggling single mothers. He had dismissed tickets for elderly citizens on fixed incomes. He had shown remarkable kindness to scared teenagers who made one-time mistakes. But he had also learned to recognize the difference between someone who deserved mercy and someone who mistook mercy for weakness. As Madison Pierce stood before him, still holding her phone, still wearing her sunglasses on her head, still radiating the absolute certainty that she would walk out of this courtroom exactly as she had walked in, Judge Caprio made a decision that would become one of the most talked about moments of his long career. He was going to give her every opportunity to show respect, and when she inevitably failed to do so, he was going to teach her a lesson that her father's money could never have prepared her for. Judge Caprio's voice carried the warmth that had made him beloved throughout Providence, but there was an undertone of firmness that experienced courtroom observers recognized immediately. "Good morning, Miss Pierce." Please remove your sunglasses completely and put your phone away. This is a courtroom, not a coffee shop. The words were polite, almost gentle, but they carried the weight of authority that came from nearly 4 decades of presiding over this exact courtroom. Madison looked up from her phone with an expression that suggested she had been interrupted during something important rather than reminded of basic courtroom etiquette. She took a full 10 seconds to process the request, her thumb continuing to scroll for several of those seconds before she finally acknowledged that someone had spoken to her. Her response to this simple, reasonable request revealed everything Judge Caprio needed to know about who he was dealing with. She slid the sunglasses from the top of her head down onto the bridge of her nose, then back up again, a gesture that somehow managed to be both compliance and defiance simultaneously. She placed her phone on the podium in front of her rather than putting it away, leaving it face up where she could still see the screen light up with notifications. Can we make this quick? I have a lunch reservation at noon. The words came out with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told that her schedule was not the center of the universe, someone who genuinely believed that a lunch reservation held the same weight as a court proceeding. The gallery reacted immediately with quiet murmurs of disapproval. An elderly woman in the second row leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made them both shake their heads. A man in a work uniform crossed his arms and settled back in his seat with the expression of someone preparing to watch justice finally catch up with privilege. Even the court reporter's fingers hesitated briefly over her keyboard, as if momentarily stunned by the audacity of what she had just heard. Judge Caprio's patience, legendary throughout the Providence legal community, remained intact, though his voice took on a firmer edge that signaled the first level of warning. Miss Pierce, I asked you to remove your sunglasses completely and put your phone away completely. This hearing has my full attention. It needs yours. The emphasis on the word completely left no room for misinterpretation. This was not a suggestion or a preference. This was a requirement. Madison's response to this second, firmer request demonstrated the pattern of behavior that had brought her to this moment. She let out an exaggerated sigh, the kind reserved for dealing with particularly difficult store clerks or service workers who didn't immediately grasp that she was someone important. She grabbed her sunglasses with unnecessary force and tossed them into her designer bag with a gesture that managed to convey both compliance and contempt. Fine. Let's just do this. The words were accompanied by an eye roll so pronounced that people in the back row could see it clearly. She left her phone exactly where it was, face up on the podium, a small act of defiance that said she would follow instructions only to the minimum extent required and not 1 degree further. Judge Caprio opened the file in front of him with deliberate slowness, giving Madison one more opportunity to recognize the seriousness of her situation and adjust her attitude accordingly. Miss Pierce, you're here regarding a serious violation. You were clocked at 80 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour residential zone. That's more than double the speed limit. The officer's report indicates you nearly struck a child on a bicycle. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. A child on a bicycle. A residential zone. 80 miles per hour. These were not abstract concepts or minor infractions. This was the kind of reckless behavior that destroyed families and left communities traumatized. Any reasonable person hearing those words would show some indication of remorse, some acknowledgement of how serious the situation could have been. Madison Pierce was not a reasonable person. That kid wasn't even close to my car. Her voice carried the defensive irritation of someone who felt unjustly accused rather than the appropriate concern of someone who had endangered a child's life. And everyone speeds on that street. The limit should be higher. Plus, I was late for a photo shoot. She delivered these justifications as if they were perfectly logical explanations rather than a catalog of escalating entitlement. In her worldview, the speed limit was wrong, everyone else broke it too, so why shouldn't she? And her photo shoot was obviously more important than the safety of a 9-year-old boy trying to ride his bicycle home from school. The courtroom's reaction was immediate and visceral. Multiple people gasped audibly. The elderly woman in the second row pressed her hand to her chest as if physically struck by the callousness of Madison's words. A younger woman near the back whispered to her companion, "That could have been my son," her voice carrying just far enough for the microphones to catch it. Even the bailiff, trained to maintain absolute professional neutrality, shifted his weight slightly in a way that suggested he was having trouble believing what he had just heard. Judge Caprio's expression remained controlled, but something in his eyes changed, a hardening that suggested he had moved from hoping this young woman would show respect to accepting that she would not. "Miss Pierce, you could have killed that child. Do you understand the severity of traveling 80 miles per hour on a residential street where children live and play?" The question was direct, designed to cut through her justifications and force her to confront the reality of what she had done. Her answer would determine whether there was any possibility of reaching her through reason or whether stronger measures would be necessary. Madison's response to Judge Caprio's direct question about understanding the severity of nearly killing a child revealed the complete absence of self-awareness that had defined her entire life. "I'm an excellent driver. I've never hit anyone." The statement was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed that past luck guaranteed future immunity from consequences. That kid should have been on the sidewalk, not the street. And honestly, if parents can't control their kids, that's not my problem. The words fell into the courtroom like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and outrage that spread through the gallery in waves. A woman in the third row stood up partially, her face flushed with anger, before her husband gently pulled her back down. The mother who had whispered earlier about her son now spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Oh my God, did she really just say that?" The question hung in the air, rhetorical but devastating, because everyone had heard exactly what Madison said and no one could quite believe the level of callousness it represented. Judge Caprio's face transformed in a way that regular attendees of his courtroom had rarely seen. The warmth that typically characterized his interactions disappeared, replaced by an expression of controlled disappointment that somehow carried more weight than anger ever could. "Miss Pierce, I'm looking at your record. This is your 7th traffic violation in 2 years." Judge Caprio's voice had taken on the quality of someone reading facts rather than asking questions, someone who already knew the answers and was simply giving the defendant enough rope to hang herself. 7 violations in 24 months meant this wasn't bad luck or a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a pattern, a lifestyle, a fundamental belief that traffic laws were suggestions that didn't apply to someone like her. Madison's response demonstrated that she had learned absolutely nothing from any of those previous 7 encounters with law enforcement. "So, I paid for all those. Well, my dad paid. Same thing." The casual admission that she had never personally faced financial consequences for any of her violations was delivered without a trace of shame or recognition that this might be part of the problem. "That's how it works, right? You get a ticket, you pay it, done." Her understanding of the legal system was transactional and simplistic, the worldview of someone who believed everything could be reduced to a simple exchange of money. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child who should have learned them years ago. "No, Miss Pierce. That's not how it works. Each violation represents a choice to endanger others. Your previous tickets weren't just financial transactions. They were warnings that you ignored." The explanation was clear, direct, and completely wasted on someone who had already decided that her perspective was the only one that mattered. Madison's face showed irritation rather than understanding, the expression of someone who felt lectured rather than educated. "Look, I don't have time for a lecture." She picked up her phone from the podium where it had been sitting and began scrolling again, a gesture so breathtakingly disrespectful that even people who had been trying to give her the benefit of the doubt now sat forward in their seats with expressions of disbelief. "Just tell me the fine and I'll have my dad's assistant send a check." The words were accompanied by the soft clicking of her thumb against the phone screen, the sound somehow more insulting than if she had simply yelled at the judge. Judge Caprio's voice cut through the courtroom with sudden sharpness that made several people in the gallery sit up straighter. "Miss Pierce, put that phone down immediately." The command left no room for interpretation or gradual compliance. This was a direct order from a judge to a defendant who had crossed a line that most people knew better than to approach. Madison's response revealed the depth of her entitlement and the completeness of her inability to read a room. She didn't put the phone down immediately. She finished typing whatever message she had been composing, her thumb moving across the screen for several more seconds while the entire courtroom watched in stunned silence. "There. Done. Happy?" The sarcasm in her voice was unmistakable, the tone of a teenager being forced to clean her room rather than an adult being held accountable for endangering lives. She placed the phone back on the podium with enough force to make a small clicking sound, but she left it face up where she could still see it, a gesture that said she would follow the letter of the instruction while completely ignoring its spirit. The gallery's reaction had moved beyond whispers and murmurs into something approaching collective outrage. People were no longer trying to be quiet about their disapproval. A man in a veteran's cap spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable." A woman who appeared to be a teacher shook her head and said to her companion, "This is what we're dealing with now. Kids who think respect is optional." The bailiff had moved slightly closer to the podium, not because he thought Madison was physically dangerous but because the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted into territory that required heightened attention. Judge Caprio picked up a document from his desk, his movements deliberate and controlled, the actions of someone who had made a decision about how this hearing would proceed. Miss Pierce, the officer's report says that when he pulled you over, you told him your father would take care of this and that he was wasting your time. Is that accurate? The question was designed to let Madison either accept responsibility for her words or dig herself deeper. She chose the latter without hesitation. Yeah. He was wasting my time. I told him who my father is and that we have lawyers. I don't see what the big deal is. The admission came without shame or recognition that this might reflect poorly on her character. Judge Caprio's voice dropped to a tone that carried more authority than shouting ever could, the controlled disappointment of someone who had given every opportunity for respect and watched them all be casually dismissed. The big deal, Miss Pierce, is that you seem to believe that who your father is exempts you from basic traffic laws that exist to protect everyone. The statement was delivered as fact rather than accusation, an observation based on everything Madison had said and done since entering the courtroom. Madison's response demonstrated that she had moved beyond mere disrespect into active hostility, the defensive anger of someone who felt challenged rather than corrected. It's not about exemption. It's about reality. She shifted her weight, her body language radiating defiance. My dad is Richard Pierce. He develops half this city. You really think a speeding ticket is going to stick? He's going to call his lawyers and this goes away. It always does. The words revealed the exact pattern that had created the person standing before the court, a lifetime of watching consequences disappear through the application of money and legal pressure. The gallery erupted in whispers that were no longer quiet or polite. People were openly discussing what they were witnessing, their voices carrying across the courtroom in a wave of collective disapproval. Judge Caprio allowed the murmurs to settle before responding with words that would be replayed thousands of times across social media in the coming days. Miss Pierce, I don't care if your father owns the entire city. In this courtroom you follow the same laws as everyone else. The simplicity of the statement made it powerful, the fundamental principle of equal justice delivered without embellishment or qualification. Madison's reaction to this clear assertion of legal equality was to laugh, an actual laugh that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot in a library. Oh please. You're a municipal court judge. My dad's lawyers went to Harvard. Where'd you go to law school? The insult was deliberate and calculated, designed to diminish Judge Caprio's authority by comparing his credentials to those of expensive attorneys. She looked toward the gallery as if expecting them to share her amusement, as if she believed there were other people in the room who would appreciate her wit rather than be appalled by her arrogance. This whole thing is just adorable. The word choice was particularly telling, reducing the entire legal system to something cute and quaint rather than serious and consequential. The moment that followed would define everything that came after. Judge Caprio stood up. Slowly. Deliberately. The action itself was rare enough that people who attended his court regularly recognized its significance immediately. When Judge Caprio stood up during a hearing, it meant a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. The courtroom fell into complete silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy and weighted, where even breathing seems too loud. Madison's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second as she registered that something had changed, though her arrogance wouldn't allow her to fully comprehend what that change meant. Judge Caprio's voice when he spoke was quiet but carried to every corner of the courtroom with perfect clarity. Miss Pierce, in 38 years on this bench, I have dealt with thousands of defendants. Scared teenagers, struggling parents, elderly people on fixed incomes. I have shown compassion to those who showed respect. But you walked into my courtroom like you were doing us a favor by appearing. You have shown nothing but contempt for this process, for the law, and for the people around you. Each sentence landed with increasing weight, building toward something that everyone sensed would be significant. Before Judge Caprio could continue, he reached for a folder that had been sitting on his bench throughout the entire hearing, a folder that Madison had not noticed and certainly had not worried about. Miss Pierce, before we continue, I want you to see something. He nodded to the clerk, who activated the large monitor that was mounted on the courtroom wall. The screen flickered to life, and what appeared made several people in the gallery gasp audibly. It was Madison's own Instagram story from 2 days earlier, preserved forever despite her belief that social media posts were temporary and consequence-free. The video showed her behind the wheel of her car, her face clearly visible as she smiled at the camera she was holding while driving. The speedometer was perfectly framed in the shot, showing 90 miles per hour. Her voice came through the courtroom speakers with crystal clarity, cheerful and completely unaware of how damning her own words would become. Daddy's lawyers are better than your laws. The emoji she had added, a nail polish hand, appeared at the bottom of the screen. The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations that the bailiff didn't even attempt to quiet because he was too stunned himself by what he was witnessing. Madison's face transformed from smirking confidence to pale shock in the space of a single heartbeat. That was just a joke. Her voice had lost all its earlier certainty, replaced by the first hints of genuine fear. I was exaggerating. Judge Caprio let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding with devastating calm. A joke? You were traveling 90 miles per hour on a public highway, filming yourself with your phone, and mocking the legal system. That's your idea of humor? But the judge wasn't finished. The clerk advanced to the next image, another screenshot from Madison's social media account, this one from the previous week. It showed the exterior of this very courthouse with Madison posing in front of it, making an exaggerated pouty face. The caption read, "Ugh, traffic court. Adorable poor people trying to feel important." The laughing emoji that followed the text seemed to mock not just the legal system but everyone who worked within it and everyone who appeared before it. The reaction from the gallery was no longer shocked whispers but open anger. She called us adorable poor people? A woman's voice carried clearly across the courtroom. A man in work clothes stood up, his face flushed. I took time off from my job to be here. I'm fighting a ticket because I can't afford the fine. And she thinks that's adorable? Judge Caprio held up his hand, requesting silence not because he disagreed with the gallery's outrage but because he needed to continue. The screen changed one more time, showing a third post, this one from several months earlier. It was a screenshot of a text conversation between Madison and one of her friends. The friend had written, "Girl, another ticket? You're so bad." Madison's response was clearly visible. "Laws are for poor people. My dad will make it go away like always." The three words, "laws are for poor people," seemed to encapsulate everything that was wrong with Madison's worldview, everything that had led to this moment. Judge Caprio's voice cut through the noise with surgical precision. "Miss Pierce, you posted these publicly. To 47,000 followers. There's no privacy expectation when you broadcast your contempt for the legal system to the entire world." Madison stood frozen, her earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization that she had created the evidence of her own destruction and posted it for everyone to see. The courtroom remained in tense silence as Judge Caprio prepared to deliver his judgment, but before he could speak, a voice came from the gallery that changed the entire atmosphere. "Your Honor, if I may address the court." Richard Pierce stood slowly from his seat in the back row, a well-dressed man in his late 50s whose face carried the weight of watching his daughter's public humiliation unfold in real time. Judge Caprio nodded his permission, and Richard Pierce walked forward with the bearing of someone who had finally accepted a truth he had been avoiding for years. "Your Honor, my daughter is young and foolish. I take responsibility for not teaching her proper respect. If you'll allow me to pay whatever fine is appropriate, I'll ensure she completes any required traffic school and I promise this won't happen again." The words came from a place of paternal desperation, the instinct to protect a child from consequences even when those consequences were desperately needed. Judge Caprio's response was firm but not unkind, the words of someone who understood grief and parental love but also understood enabling and its devastating effects. "Mr. Pierce, with all due respect, that's the problem. You've been paying fines and making problems disappear for years. How's that working out?" The question hung in the air, rhetorical but devastating in its simple truth. Richard Pierce's face crumpled slightly, the mask of successful businessman falling away to reveal a grieving widower who had made terrible mistakes out of love and fear. "Your Honor, she's my only child. Her mother passed when she was young. I've probably been too lenient." The admission cost him something to make, the public acknowledgement of failure as a parent. Judge Caprio's voice softened almost imperceptibly, speaking to the father rather than the enabler. "Mr. Pierce, I understand loss. I understand wanting to protect your child. But what you've done isn't protection. It's prevention, preventing her from learning, from growing, from becoming a responsible adult. Your daughter doesn't need another check written on her behalf. She needs to understand that actions have consequences and that those consequences apply to her just as they apply to everyone else." The words were delivered with the authority of someone who had raised 5 children himself, who understood that real love sometimes meant allowing pain in service of growth. Richard Pierce's eyes filled with tears and he nodded slowly, the gesture of a man who knew he was hearing truth even though it hurt. "I know. I've known for a while. But every time I try to set boundaries I think about losing her mother, and I can't bear the thought of her being angry with me too." Madison, watching her father's emotional breakdown, made one final attempt to reassert control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her ability to manipulate. "Dad, don't listen to him. Just call the lawyers. We don't have to sit here and take this. Let's just leave." She actually took a step toward the courtroom doors as if she could simply walk away from legal proceedings the way she walked away from everything else in her life that made her uncomfortable. Judge Caprio's voice cut through her movement with the sharpness of a blade. "Miss Pierce, sit down." The command left no room for interpretation. The bailiff moved to block the doorway and Madison spun around, her face flushed red with a mixture of fear and rage. "You can't tell me what to do. I'm leaving. Send me the fine." The declaration would have carried more weight if her voice hadn't been shaking, if her hands weren't trembling, if the entire courtroom wasn't watching her complete meltdown with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. Judge Caprio stood again, his full authority embodied in that simple action. "Miss Pierce, attempting to leave during a hearing is contempt of court. You will sit down immediately, or I will have you placed in custody right now. Do you understand me?" The threat of actual jail time penetrated Madison's defensive anger in a way that nothing else had managed to do. She sat down abruptly, her legs seeming to give out beneath her as the reality of potential handcuffs and a jail cell became suddenly, terrifyingly real. Judge Caprio remained standing, his voice filling the courtroom with the weight of decades of judicial experience. "Miss Pierce, your behavior today has been one of the most disrespectful displays I have witnessed in nearly 4 decades on this bench. You have mocked this court, endangered lives, and shown absolute contempt for the rule of law." He paused, letting the words settle into every corner of the room. "For reckless driving at 80 miles per hour in a 35 zone, I am fining you $1,000, the maximum allowed. For expired registration, $500. For contempt of court based on your behavior today, an additional $2,500. For dangerous driving with prior violations, $1,000 in court costs. Your total is $5,000, due immediately with no payment plan available." Madison gasped, her face going pale as she processed an amount of money that was probably more than she had ever personally paid for anything in her life. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished with the financial penalties. "Your driver's license is suspended for 6 months, effective immediately. Not reduced, not delayed, not negotiable. 6 full months. You will complete 80 hours of community service with the city's youth traffic safety program, where you will visit schools and explain to children why speeding is dangerous and why you are an example of what not to do. You will attend a victim impact panel where you will hear from families who have lost loved ones to reckless driving. You will write a 2,000-word essay on why traffic laws exist and submit it to this court within 30 days. And you will delete that Instagram post mocking the legal system and replace it with a public apology, or you will spend an additional 30 days in jail for contempt." The comprehensive nature of the punishment left no escape route, no way to simply write a check and make the problem disappear. Madison sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face and ruining the expensive makeup she had applied so carefully that morning. But Judge Caprio had one more condition that would ensure this wasn't just another problem solved by her father's money. "Mr. Pierce, I am ordering that these fines be paid from your daughter's own funds, not yours. If she doesn't have the money, she can earn it. If she doesn't pay within 90 days, a warrant will be issued for her arrest. Do you understand?" Richard Pierce, tears still visible in his eyes, nodded with something that looked like relief mixed with grief. "Yes, Your Honor. Thank you." Madison turned to her father with desperation written across her features. "Dad, you're not seriously going to let him do this to me?" Richard Pierce looked at his daughter with an expression of love mixed with the firmness he should have shown years earlier. "Madison, enough. The judge is right. I've failed you by protecting you from consequences. Starting today that changes. You'll pay these fines yourself. You'll complete this service yourself. And if you can't handle that, then maybe you'll finally understand what growing up actually means." The words from her father seemed to hit harder than anything Judge Caprio had said, the recognition that her safety net had finally, irrevocably been removed. Judge Caprio delivered his final words with the measured wisdom that had defined his career. "Miss Pierce, you're 23 years old. Young enough that this can be a turning point instead of a defining characteristic. 5 years from now, you can look back on today as the worst day of your life or as the day that forced you to change. Which will it be?" The gavel came down with finality, the sound echoing through a courtroom where justice had been delivered not through anger but through the patient, firm insistence that respect and accountability were not optional components of civilized society.